April 1965. A cramped backstage room in London's Marquee Club. Cigarette smoke hanging thick in the air. Beer bottles scattered across a table covered with newspapers and overflowing ashtrays. Mick Jagger was 21 years old and already one of the most famous faces in England. Bob Dylan was 23, and the reason half the songs on British radio existed. They'd never spoken directly before this night, but everyone in the room knew tension had been building for months. Jagger stood near the wall, beneath a Rolling Stones tour poster that showed his face larger than life. He was talking, loudly, the way young men talk when they want everyone to hear but pretend they're just having a casual conversation. "Our version is tighter," Jagger said to Keith Richards, who sat nearby tuning a guitar. "More energy. The arrangements are stronger." Dylan sat at a small table, arms crossed, saying nothing. His denim jacket was worn at the elbows. His hair was a mess of dark curls. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, but he was listening. Jagger continued, his voice carrying that particular cockiness that comes from 6 months of screaming fans and #1 records. "I mean, don't get me wrong. The original is fine, but we made it a proper rock song." Keith didn't respond. He'd seen this mood in Mick before. The need to prove something, to establish dominance, especially around other successful musicians. Dylan took a slow drink from his beer, still said nothing, and that silence was about to cost Jagger something he didn't know he valued: Dylan's respect. To understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand what the Rolling Stones were in 1965. They weren't the legendary band they'd become. They were young British musicians riding the wave of the British invasion, covering American blues and folk songs, because that's what got them noticed. Their first album contained covers. Their second album contained covers. Their biggest hits were other people's songs played faster, louder, with Jagger's distinctive voice in the Stones' raw energy. And Bob Dylan's songs were everywhere in their setlist. The Stones had covered Like a Rolling Stone in their live shows, reworking it with heavier guitars and Jagger's swagger. British audiences loved it. Some critics said the Stones version was more exciting than Dylan's original. That's what Jagger believed. That's what he'd come to tell Dylan. In 1965, covering someone's song was supposed to be a compliment. It meant you respected their work enough to interpret it. Folk musicians expected it. Blues musicians welcomed it. But Dylan was different. Dylan didn't want interpreters. He wanted artists who created their own vision, who wrote their own truths, who didn't need to borrow his voice to find theirs. The Stones didn't understand this yet. Jagger certainly didn't. He thought covering Dylan was honoring him, improving him even. He was about to learn why that assumption was a mistake. 1965 was the year the British invasion reached its peak. The Beatles had conquered America. The Rolling Stones were right behind them. British bands were everywhere, and most of them built their sound on American blues, American folk, and American rock and roll. They took the music Americans had created, added their own energy, and sold it back to America as something new. Some American musicians appreciated it. Others felt colonized. Dylan fell somewhere in the middle. He respected the Beatles' songwriting. He acknowledged their talent. But the Stones were different. The Stones were still primarily a cover band. Their original songs were good but not yet great. They were talented musicians playing other people's ideas. And Jagger's cockiness rankled Dylan in a way that was hard to articulate. It wasn't just that Jagger was confident. Dylan understood confidence. He had plenty himself. It was that Jagger's confidence came from performing someone else's work and claiming to do it better. Dylan had spent years finding his voice, writing songs that came from his experiences, his observations, his soul. He'd been booed at Newport Folk Festival for going electric. He'd been called a traitor for evolving beyond folk music's limitations. And now here was Mick Jagger standing in front of him, bragging about making Dylan's songs better without having written a word of them. The tension in that room wasn't just between two men. It was between two philosophies of what music should be. Jagger was still talking about arrangements, about energy, about how British audiences responded to the Stones' version versus Dylan's original. Keith had stopped tuning his guitar. Even he could feel the temperature dropping. Other people in the room, roadies, a journalist, a few hangers-on, had gone quiet. Everyone sensed something was building. Dylan set down his beer bottle. The sound of glass touching wood was loud in the sudden silence. He looked directly at Jagger for the first time. "You finished?" Dylan's voice was flat, not angry, just empty of interest. Jagger smiled, that famous smile, the one that had charmed thousands of fans. "I'm just saying, mate, your songs are brilliant, but they work better with our sound." Dylan nodded slowly. "Your sound?" "Yeah, more rock, less folk, more energy." "More energy," Dylan repeated. Jagger was starting to realize he'd miscalculated. The way Dylan was looking at him, like he was examining something mildly distasteful, wasn't the reaction he'd expected. "Look," Jagger tried again, "I'm not trying to insult you. I think you're a great songwriter. That's why we cover your stuff." Dylan leaned back in his chair. "You cover my stuff because you haven't figured out how to write your own yet." The room went dead silent. Keith looked up from his guitar. The roadies stopped moving. Even the journalist who'd been pretending not to listen froze with his pen above his notebook. Jagger's smile faltered. "We write our own songs." "Not many," Dylan said, still in that flat, emotionless voice. "And the ones you do write aren't the ones people remember, are they?" The compliment Jagger thought he'd been giving had just become an accusation. Jagger's face flushed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by other musicians. The Stones were the bad boys of rock and roll. They were dangerous, rebellious. But Dylan wasn't impressed by rebellion. He'd been rebelling before the Stones existed. "Our version of Like a Rolling Stone killed at the club last week," Jagger said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Standing ovation, 3 encores." "Good for you," Dylan replied. "People loved it, more than the original." "Because they're drunk," Jagger laughed, but it sounded forced. "No, because we made it better. Faster tempo, heavier guitars, more exciting." Dylan picked up his beer again, took a slow drink, set it back down. "You made it louder," he said finally. "That's not the same as better. It's what rock and roll is supposed to be. Loud, fast, exciting." "Is that what you think rock and roll is? Just volume?" Jagger was getting defensive now. His voice had an edge. "We're selling records. We're filling venues. People want our version. People want a lot of things. Doesn't make those things good." Keith intervened, trying to diffuse the situation. "Bob, Mick's just saying we put our own spin on it. That's all. It's not a competition." Dylan looked at Keith, then back at Jagger. "If it's not a competition," Dylan said quietly, "why is he bragging?" Jagger's jaw tightened. His hand pointed at Dylan, the gesture sharp, aggressive. "I came here to tell you I respect your work. By telling me you do it better? We do." And there it was, the truth underneath the compliments, the arrogance that Dylan had heard from the moment Jagger started talking. Dylan stood up, slowly, deliberately. The room felt smaller suddenly. Everyone was watching. Dylan walked over to where Jagger stood, not close enough to be threatening, but close enough that Jagger had to look at him directly. "You want to know what I think?" Dylan asked. Jagger crossed his arms. "Sure. I think you're talented. You've got presence. You can work a crowd. Keith's a good guitar player. The rhythm section is solid." Jagger waited. "But you're still figuring out who you are. And until you do, you're going to keep playing other people's songs and telling yourself you're improving them." "We are improving them." Dylan's expression didn't change. "Then write your own. 3 words. Simple, direct." Jagger opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "We do write our own. Not enough, and not well enough. Because if you could write songs as good as the ones you're covering, you wouldn't need to cover them." The accusation hung in the air like the cigarette smoke. Jagger's face was red now. His hand was still pointing at Dylan, but the gesture had lost its confidence. "You're being a prick." "I'm being honest. You're jealous that people like our version." Dylan almost smiled. "Almost. If that's what you need to believe." Keith stood up. "Mick, let's go." But Jagger wasn't done. His pride was wounded, his ego bruised. "Our version is better. It's tighter, it's more powerful, it's borrowed," Dylan interrupted. It's borrowed. Every note, every word. You didn't create anything. You just played it louder. That's what covers are. Yeah, Dylan said. That's what covers are. The insult was in his tone, the dismissal, the implication that covering songs wasn't real artistry. It was just performance. Jagger stared at Dylan for a long moment. Dylan stared back, unmoved, unimpressed. Finally, Jagger turned to Keith. Let's get out of here. Keith grabbed his guitar. The two of them headed for the door. As Jagger reached for the handle, he turned back. One last attempt to save face. You know what your problem is, Dylan. You take yourself too seriously. Dylan sat back down at the table, picked up his beer. And you don't take yourself seriously enough. Jagger's hand was on the doorknob. He wanted to say something else, something cutting, something that would put Dylan in his place. But nothing came, so he walked out. Keith followed, not looking back. The door closed. The room stayed silent for several seconds. Then the journalist laughed, nervously. That was intense. Dylan didn't respond. He was already thinking about something else. The confrontation was over. He'd said what needed saying. One of the roadies spoke up. You think he'll hold a grudge? Dylan shrugged. Don't care. But Mick Jagger cared. Because that three-word response, then write your own, would haunt him for months. The story of what happened in that backstage room spread quickly, not through press, not through official channels, but through the underground network of musicians, roadies, and club owners who witnessed these moments and shared them in bars and dressing rooms across London. Within a week, everyone in the British rock scene knew. Dylan had told Jagger to write his own songs. Some people thought Dylan was arrogant. Others thought he was right. But Jagger couldn't stop thinking about it. Because Dylan had exposed something the Rolling Stones were already worried about. They were successful. They were popular. But were they artists? Over the next 6 months, something changed in the Stones' approach. They started writing more original material. I Can't Get No Satisfaction came out that summer. Their first genuine masterpiece. A song that was uniquely theirs, that nobody could accuse them of borrowing. Keith later said that Dylan's challenge had stung, but it had also motivated them. We realized we were hiding behind covers, Keith told an interviewer years later. Bob called us out, and he was right. Jagger never publicly admitted the confrontation had affected him, but privately, friends said he became obsessed with proving Dylan wrong. Every new Stones song was analyzed. Is this original enough? Is this really ours? Or are we still just mimicking? By 1966, the Rolling Stones had transformed from a cover band into one of the most innovative groups in rock music, and Dylan's three words had been the catalyst. Dylan and Jagger never became friends. They saw each other at events over the years. Award shows, benefit concerts, industry parties. They were always polite, professional. But the warmth that might have existed if that April night had gone differently never developed. In the 1980s, during a tribute concert, they performed together briefly. The audience went wild, two legends sharing a stage. But backstage afterward, they barely spoke. Jagger had long since proven he could write classics. Sympathy for the Devil, Gimme Shelter. You can't always get what you want. The Rolling Stones were no longer a cover band. They were legitimate artists with a catalog that rivaled anyone's. But Dylan had never acknowledged it, never said, "You proved me wrong," never offered the validation that Jagger, despite decades of success, still wanted. Someone asked Dylan about it once, in an interview in the 1990s. Do you regret what you said to Mick Jagger back in 1965? Dylan thought for a moment. No, he needed to hear it. But the Stones went on to write great songs. Yeah, they did after I told them to. The interviewer laughed, but Dylan wasn't joking. The confrontation between Dylan and Jagger became one of rock music's most important teaching moments, because it asked a question that every musician eventually faces. What's the difference between performing and creating? Covering songs isn't wrong. Tribute bands fill stadiums. Artists reinterpret classics and make them beautiful. But there's a difference between acknowledging influence and claiming superiority over the original creator. Jagger's mistake wasn't covering Dylan's songs. It was bragging about doing them better without recognizing the difference between performing someone's vision and creating your own. Dylan's response, "Then write your own," became a rallying cry for originality, for artistic integrity, for the idea that real artists create rather than imitate. The Rolling Stones learned the lesson. They became one of the greatest rock bands in history by finding their own voice. Other musicians learned it too. The British invasion bands that survived weren't the ones who just covered American music better. They were the ones who used those influences to create something new. Today, music historians point to that April night as a turning point, not just for the Stones, but for rock music as an art form. It was the moment when good enough to cover became good enough to create, when performing gave way to artistry, when Mick Jagger learned that respect isn't earned by doing someone's work louder, it's earned by doing your own work better. Well, there you have it, the night Bob Dylan told Mick Jagger to write his own songs. 3 words that changed the Rolling Stones forever. You know, one of the things we love most about making these videos is hearing from people like you who actually lived through this era. Your comments and stories give us perspective that no history book ever could. Maybe you were one of the fans screaming at a Stones concert in 1965. Maybe you bought Like a Rolling Stone the week it came out. Maybe you remember exactly where you were when you first heard these artists on the radio. Those memories matter. Your generation witnessed the birth of modern rock and roll, and every time you share a story in the comments, you're preserving that history. So please, if you're enjoying these untold stories from the music you grew up with, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and most importantly, leave a comment telling us your Dylan or Stones memory. We genuinely want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.